The Duke of Renden had come to the orangery at Harcombe only to be alone, and instead he became a witness. He stood half in shadow behind a bank of citron trees, a glass of untouched wine in his hand, when a door opened at the far end of the glass gallery, and a man's voice came low and careless through the warm green air, and the Duke saw the woman in the doorway freeze, as though a blade had been laid flat against her spine. She had come in unheard as he had, and she had caught a betrothed with his mouth against another woman's throat, and Searle watched the whole of her marriage die in her face while the man who was killing it did not even know she was there. He knew the man. Everyone under that roof knew Mr. Lucian Ferrers, the handsome, easy-mannered gentleman who was to marry the niece of Sir Osric Wenlock come the week's end. And now Ferrers had his hand fisted in the loosened hair of Mrs. Sabine Farley, the fashionable widow, and he was laughing softly against her skin, and he was saying words that the Duke would have given a good deal not to have heard on the young woman's behalf. 3 days, Ferrers murmured. 3 days, and the dull little Wenlock creature is mine, and her uncle's money with her, and then my heart. We needn't be so careful. A plain wife in the country and a warm one in town. It is how sensible men arrange their lives. The widow said something, laughing, that the Duke did not catch. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the girl in the doorway. She had not made a sound. That was the thing that struck him, the thing he would remember. A lesser woman would have cried out, or wept, or fled with a rustle of skirts that would have announced her ruin to the whole company beyond. This one only stood, one gloved hand gone white on the door frame, her chin lifting by some slow degree as though she were dragging it up out of deep water. Her face had gone the color of the candle wax, and her eyes were enormous, and she was looking at the man she was to marry as a person looks at a house they had believed their own and find belongs to strangers. Searle did not move. To move was to be seen, and to be seen was to make her humiliation a matter of 3 people instead of the one blessed privacy of her own grief. He had spent the better part of 40 years learning when to hold still, and he held still now, and he watched a young woman he did not know teach herself, in the space of a dozen heartbeats, how to survive. He knew her name too, though he had never been introduced, Miss Ianthe Wenlock. He had noticed her earlier that evening across the crowded rooms because she had not been trying to be noticed, which at Harcombe was rare enough to be remarkable. A slight, dark-haired young woman in a gown 2 seasons behind the fashion, standing near the wall while the marriageable daughters of richer houses flashed and turned in the candlelight. He had thought her plain, in the incurious way a man thinks anything about a stranger. He did not think her plain now. He thought her the only living thing in the room. Ferrers laughed again. The widow murmured, "And if the girl should ever learn of us? Ianthe?" Ferrers held a smile so genuine it was almost tender in its contempt. "She hasn't the spirit to learn anything she isn't told. She'll be grateful I offered for her at all. A girl with no mother, no fortune to speak of, and a face made for a governess. She knows precisely what she is worth, and she is worth me, and she thanks God for it every night in her prayers. I promise you she suspects nothing." In the doorway, Ianthe Wenlock closed her eyes. And the Duke of Renden, who had a reputation across 3 counties for coldness, for a heart gone to iron after everything the world had done to break it, felt something turn over in his chest that he had believed long dead. It was not pity. Pity was a soft, downward thing. This was the opposite. It was the sensation of a wrong so clean and so complete that it demanded, the way hunger demands, to be answered. She opened her eyes. She looked, for one moment, directly across the length of the orangery, not at Ferrers, not at the widow, but into the shadow where Searle stood, as though she had felt the weight of being watched. Their eyes met. He saw her understand that she was not alone, that a stranger had seen everything, that her private ruin was private no longer. He braced for her to flinch, to crumple, to hate him for the witnessing. She did not. She held his gaze across the dim green air, and she did not ask him for anything. And she did not apologize for existing, and after a moment she inclined her head to him, a small, exact, unhurried bow, the courtesy of one person acknowledging another in a place where courtesy was the last thing either of them owned. Then she turned without haste and stepped back through the door she had come by, and drew it closed behind her so quietly that Ferrers and his widow never once looked up. The Duke stood alone with them for the length of a breath. Then he set his wine down upon the marble ledge with a small deliberate click, and Ferrers whirled, and the widow gasped and stumbled back with her hand at her disordered collar. "Your Grace." Ferris's charm reasserted itself over his face like water closing over a stone. "I did not, that is, we were only—" "You were only," the Duke agreed. His voice was very quiet. It was the quietness that men who had crossed him learned to fear, though Ferrers did not yet know enough to be afraid. "Do not trouble yourself to finish the sentence, Mr. Ferrers. I have a poor stomach for invention, and yours would need to be very good. Your Grace mistakes what you saw. I rarely mistake what I see. It is nearly the only talent I can claim." Searle looked at him for a long, unhurried moment, at the fine coat, the easy shoulders, the mouth still soft from another man's promised bride, and then he looked at Mrs. Farley, who had gone the colour of ash, and he looked back at Ferrers, and he found he did not trust himself to say anything further that would remain within the bounds of a gentleman. So he said nothing. He inclined his head a precise half-inch, as a man does to close a door, and he walked out of the orangery the way he had come, but he did not go back to the ballroom. He went, instead, the way the girl had gone. He found her on the terrace, at the stone balustrade above the dark sweep of the Harcombe Gardens, standing with her back to the lit windows and her face lifted to a sky with no moon in it. She heard his step and did not turn. He stopped a proper distance from her, hat in hand, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the music came muffled and gay through the glass behind them, a country dance, a thing built for happiness. "You need not stay, Your Grace," she said at last. Her voice was low and even and only very slightly unsteady, like a hand held out over a long fall. "I am aware of what you saw. You may be easy. I shall not make a scene of it. I know how these things are managed. A woman weeps privately and marries anyway and calls it prudence, and everyone agrees she has done the sensible thing. Is that what you intend to do?" She was quiet. "I do not know what I intend to do," she said. "I learned 3 minutes ago that I do not know anything at all. I had thought I knew a great many things. It appears I was mistaken in every one of them." Searle came a step nearer and set his hands upon the cold stone of the balustrade, a careful yard from hers, and looked out at the dark with her. He was a man unused to offering comfort. He had received little enough of it in his own life to have any great store to give. But he understood, better than most living men, the particular vertigo of the moment when the ground a person has built their whole existence upon is revealed to have been painted canvas all along. "My name is Searle," he said. "I am told I am to be feared. You may believe it or not as you like. It has never much mattered to me which people chose. But I will tell you one thing, Miss Wenlock, and you may do with it what you will. What that man said of you in there is the sort of thing a small man says to feel large. It is not a description of you. It is a confession of him. Do not make the error, I have seen clever women make it, of taking a coward's account of your worth as though it were an honest one." She turned her head then, and looked at him fully for the first time in the light that fell across the terrace, and he saw that her eyes were dry, and that they were the grey of weather coming in off the sea, and that there was in them not the softness he had been told women's eyes held, but a kind of banked, exhausted courage that he recognized because he had worn it himself for the better part of 2 decades. "You are very certain," she said, "of the worth of a woman you have never spoken to before this hour." "I am certain of what I saw," he answered. "You caught a man betraying you, in the cruelest words a man can use, and you did not scream, and you did not faint, and you did not beg. You bowed to a stranger in a dark room, and you walked out on your own feet with your head level. I have watched dukes and generals meet lesser blows with less. I do not need to have spoken to you, Miss Wenlock. I was there." For the first time something moved in her composure, not a break, but a tremor along the surface of it, like wind across still water. She looked away quickly, back out at the garden, and he had the sense of her taking that sentence and putting it somewhere deep and holding it, the way a person holds a coal against the cold with both hands, because it is the only warmth in the world. "Do you know," she said after a silence, and her voice had steadied into something almost like wonder, "no one has spoken to me as though I were a person for a very long time. I had nearly forgotten what it sounds like. My uncle speaks to me as one speaks to a servant one is fond of. My aunt speaks to me as one speaks to a task that must be got through. Mr. Ferrers spoke to me, I understand now, as one speaks to a purse one is about to pick. And you, your grace, who are a stranger and feared, and have no reason on this earth to trouble yourself over me, stand here in the cold and speak to me as though what I think and what I feel and what I am worth are matters of consequence. I do not know whether to thank you for it or to weep, because it shows me all at once exactly how long it has been, and how hungry I did not know I was. She pressed her lips together and looked away. Forgive me. I am saying too much. It is the sort of night on which one says too much. Say all of it, said the Duke. There is no one here but me, and I have already seen the worst of your evening, and thought better of you for how you met it, not worse. You will not lower yourself in my eyes by being honest, Miss Wenlock. I have spent my life among people who are never honest, and I find it has given me a great appetite for those who are. She looked back at him then, and something in her face had eased not into happiness. It was far too soon for that, and the wound was far too new, but into a kind of steadiness, as though his words were a hand set against her back, holding her up. They will still expect me to marry him, she said very low. My uncle, my aunt, the whole of that room in there. The banns are read, the settlements are signed. My uncle has told half the county. He is not an unkind man, my uncle, but he is a practical one, and a broken engagement is a scandal, and a scandal costs money and consequence, and I am neither. When I tell them what I have seen tonight, do you know what they will say to me, Your Grace? Tell me. They will say that gentlemen have their weaknesses, and that a wise wife does not see them, and that Mr. Ferrers is respectable, I am fortunate, and that I had better dry my eyes and be married before I ruin us all. Her mouth curved, without any humour in it at all. They will say I imagined it. And then, when they cannot pretend I imagined it, they will say it does not signify, and I shall stand in the church on Thursday and give my hand to a man who called me a face-maid for a governess, and I shall say the words, and everyone will tell me how well I have done. The Duke of Rendon looked at her for a long moment in the dark. Somewhere in the last quarter of an hour a decision had begun to make itself in him, quietly, the way weather makes itself, gathering out of a clear sky before there is a cloud to show for it. He did not yet say it aloud. He had learned to distrust the fast heart and to trust the slow one, and he wanted to be certain that what moved in him now was justice and not merely the old, dangerous wish to save someone that had cost him so dearly before. Thursday, he said instead, is 3 days away. A great deal may be undone in 3 days, Miss Wenlock. I have found the world less fixed than it likes to pretend. She looked at him with something that was almost, but not quite, the beginning of a question. You speak as though you mean to do something about it. I speak as a man who has seen an injustice and finds he cannot pretend he did not. He straightened from the balustrade and set his hat upon his head. Go in when you are ready. Say nothing tonight to your uncle. Grieve if you must, but grieve behind a locked door, and let no one in that house see one thing in your face that you do not choose to show them. Can you do that? I have been doing it for years, she said. It is nearly the only talent I can claim. He heard his own words come back to him in her mouth, and something that was almost the ghost of a smile touched the hard corner of his jaw, and was gone. Then we shall get on, said the Duke of Rendon, and he bowed to her low and correct, as though she were the greatest lady in the kingdom instead of a portionless niece in a 2-year-old gown, and he went back into the light, leaving her alone with the dark and the far-off gaiety of the dancing, to begin, for the first time in her life, to imagine that her fate might belong to someone other than the men who had always assumed the disposing of it. Rendon lay 11 miles from Harcombe, and the Duke rode the distance that night rather than take his carriage, because a man who wishes to think clearly is best served by a cold wind and a good horse and no company but his own. By the time the black bulwark of his own house rose against the paling sky, he had turned the matter over on every side, and he had reached, as he had known he would, a conclusion that his steward would call madness and his late father would have called beneath him. He meant to break the marriage. And he meant, if she would have it, to put something better in its place. He was not a man given to illusions, least of all about himself. He knew what he was in the eyes of the world, the Duke of Rendon, widowed young under a cloud of things unspoken, a man whose first betrothal had ended in a scandal that the county still whispered over when it thought he could not hear. He knew they called him cold and hard and unlucky to be near. Some of it he had earned, most of it he had simply endured, because to defend oneself against gossip, and he had long ago decided he would rather be feared in silence than pitied aloud. But he knew also what it was to be sold. That was the thing that had turned in him in the orangery and would not turn back. He had been very young when his own people had arranged his first match for money and consequence, and he had learned in the hardest school, there is what it does to two lives to be bound together by everything except regard. He would not stand in a warm bright room and watch it done to a girl who had bowed to him in the dark with more dignity than the whole of Harcombe possessed between them, and do nothing and call his nothing prudence. In the morning he sent for his sister. Lady Marian Vaux was 5 years his junior, widowed as he was, and the single person on the earth to whom the Duke of Rendon told the truth. She arrived before noon, shook the rain from her cloak in his study, took one look at his face, and sat down without being asked. "You have the look," she said, "that you wore the winter you sold the Kentish farms out from under cousin Hubert. Who has offended you, and how thoroughly do you mean to answer it?" He told her. He told her all of it, plainly. In the flat, unornamented way he told her everything. And he watched her fine humour drain out of her face and something harder come in behind it, because Marian had been married for consequence too, and had been fortunate in it only by an accident that she had never once mistaken for justice. "The Wenlock girl," she said when he had finished. "I know a little of her. Sir Osric's brother's child. The brother married beneath him and died poor, and the girl was taken in out of duty and raised on the edge of the family like a governess they need not pay. I have seen her twice. She has good eyes and a still tongue, and no one has ever troubled to look at her long enough to see either. She studied her brother, and you looked. I could not help but look. I was in the room. You could have left the room, Sel. You have left 100 rooms to avoid 100 entanglements. You did not leave this one." She said it without unkindness, but she said it, because it was her office in his life to say the things no one else dared. "I am not scolding you. I am asking you to be honest with me, and with yourself, before you set your hand to a young woman's whole existence. Is this justice, brother, or is this the old wound? Are you saving her, or are you saving the boy you were, who no one saved?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, standing at the tall window with his back to her, and the wet grey park beyond the glass. "Both, I imagine," he said at last. "I have never found the two so separable as the moralists pretend. But I will tell you this, Marian. If it were only the old wound, I could bear it. I have borne it 20 years. It is the girl's face I cannot bear. She looked at me across that room after she had heard the worst that could be said of her, and she did not ask me for rescue. She only asked me, with her whole bearing, not to make her smaller than she had already been made, and I find I would give a great deal to make her larger instead." Behind him, his sister was quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. "Then you had better do it properly," Lady Marian said, "or not at all. Half a rescue is worse than none. If you break the engagement and walk away, you leave her a jilted woman with a scandal on her and a fortune hunter's spite to answer, and her uncle will be twice as glad to be rid of her, and she will be ruined in earnest. Whatever you begin, brother, you must be prepared to finish. Do you understand me? You cannot save this woman by halves and keep your conscience. I know it. Do you? Then tell me the shape of the finishing, for I will not help you begin what I do not think you will end." The Duke turned from the window. He looked at his sister, and he said the thing he had not yet said aloud even to himself, and in saying it he made it true. "The shape of the finishing," he said, "is that I marry her myself." Lady Marian did not gasp. She was not a woman who gasped. But she sat very still for a moment, and then she let out a slow breath, and then, to his surprise, she smiled a small, complicated, glad, frightened smile. "Well," she said, "that is a great deal more than I came prepared to hear. You had better tell me how you mean to arrange it without ruining her further, because a duke who breaks up a wedding to claim the bride is precisely the kind of story this county will feed on for a generation, and she is the one who will be eaten, not you." They spent the length of the afternoon over it, and by the time the light failed, they had the beginnings of a plan, not a gallant one, not a thing of drawn swords and dramatic declarations, but a careful, patient, ruinous one aimed not at Ferrers' heart, which the Duke did not believe he possessed, but at the two things such a man could not do without, his money and his good name. For while the county saw in Lucien Ferrers a charming and respectable gentleman, the Duke of Rendon, who owned a great deal of the country's debt one way or another, had reason to suspect that the charm was mortgaged and the respectability rented. A man does not court a plain heiress for a modest fortune when he keeps a fashionable widow in town, unless his need for ready money is a good deal more pressing than his manners let on. And the Duke had bankers, and the Duke had patience, and the Duke had spent 20 years learning exactly how a proud man may be taken apart without ever once raising his voice. There was a thing the Duke did not say to his sister, because he had not the words for it, and because it was not the sort of thing a man of his make said aloud, and it was this, that he had gone back over the 4 days he had watched from the corners of that house, for he had noticed Ianthe Wenlock more than he had let himself admit, and had understood in a slow accumulating way exactly what her life had been. He had seen her at the great dinner fetch a shawl for her aunt without being thanked. He had seen her give up her place at the window to a richer girl who wanted it and take the draughty seat by the door, without being asked whether she minded. He had seen her, once, correct a child's copybook in a corner while the family danced, and smile at the child, and be to the child the only warm thing in the room, and be to everyone else invisible. He had taken it, at the time, for the ordinary furniture of a great house, the poor relation, the useful cousin, the girl who fetches and carries. He saw now that he had been watching a person systematically taught, over 20 years, that she was worth precisely nothing, by people who did not even trouble to be cruel about it, which was worse than cruelty, because cruelty at least concedes that its object is a person. Neglect concedes nothing. It simply looks through you, and she had been looked through her whole life, and had learned to make herself small enough to be looked through comfortably, and had very nearly been married off in that same spirit. As one disposes of a piece of furniture that has grown inconvenient, and the wonder of it, the thing that had turned in his chest and would not turn back, was that under all that erasure there had been a whole and burning person the entire time, waiting, and no one but a stranger in a dark orangery had ever once thought to look. "You are quiet," said Lady Marian. "I am thinking," said the Duke, "that the greatest cruelties in this world wear no face at all. A villain a person can fight. But how does a girl fight a room that simply declines to see her? She cannot. She can only endure it and grow small, and call the smallness humility, and be praised for it. I have watched her be praised for it. And I find I want, more than I have wanted anything in 20 years, to stand in a room and see her, plainly, until the whole room is ashamed of itself." His sister looked at him a long moment. "That," she said gently, "is not the speech of a man doing justice, brother. That is the speech of a man in love. I will help you. God help us both, I will help you. But do not tell yourself the smaller word when the larger one is the true one. You have never been a coward except about your own heart, and you have not the time left to be one now." The Duke did not answer her, which from him was an admission, and his sister, who had known him all his life, let the matter rest and turned her clever mind instead to the work of the afternoon. Meanwhile, 11 miles away, Ianthe Wenlock was learning the price of what she had seen. She had done as the Duke told her. She had gone up to her small cold room at the top of the Harcombe wing that night and locked the door and wept as quietly as she had ever done anything, one fist pressed to her mouth, so that not even the maid in the next passage should hear the sound of a woman's whole future coming apart. And in the morning she had washed her face and pinned her hair and gone down to breakfast with her chin level and her voice steady, exactly as she had promised, and she had watched Lucien Ferrers smile at her across the eggs and the cold ham, and call her "my dear Ianthe," and press her hand as he took his leave, and she had smiled back at the man who had called her a face-maid for a governess, and she had thought, "I see you now. I did not before. But I see you now, and you do not know that I see you, and that is the one thing in this house that is mine." She had thought in the first raw hours that she would tell her uncle. She had rehearsed it. And then she had watched Sir Osric over the breakfast table, expansive and pleased, talking of the settlements and the wedding breakfast and how well it all reflected upon the family, and she had understood, cleanly and without bitterness, that the Duke had been right. They would not believe her, and then they would not care, and then they would blame her for the telling. To speak was to lose the one advantage she had, which was that no one knew what she knew, so she said nothing, and she waited. And she did not entirely dare to believe in the tall, grim stranger who had bowed to her in the dark and told her that a great deal might be undone in 3 days, and yet she found that she could not quite stop believing in him either. It was a strange thing to have a secret ally. Stranger still that he should be the Duke of Renden, whom she had heard named a dozen times in that house in tones of half-delighted horror. The cold Duke, the unlucky Duke, the one no sensible mother let her daughters near. She turned his words over and over in the dark. Do not take a coward's account of your worth as though it were an honest one. She had been taking such accounts as gospel her whole life. She had not known, until a stranger told her otherwise, that they might be refused. On the second day, a letter came for her. It came privately, not through the hall where her aunt inspected the post, but pressed into her hand by a groom in the stable yard who had clearly been paid to be discreet and to forget he had done it. The seal was heavy, dark green wax, a device she did not know, a hawk above a broken tower. She read it standing between the loose boxes with her heart going hard and quick. It did not say a great deal. It was, she would come to learn, entirely characteristic of the man that it said no more than was needful. Miss Wenlock, do nothing and agree to nothing before Thursday. Whatever pressure is put upon you to hasten matters, resist it by whatever small means you can. Plead illness, plead nerves, plead a bride's proper hesitation, anything to keep the day from being moved sooner. Trust that the ground beneath your betrothed is less solid than he believes. You are not without a friend, though the friend is a poor one and knows it. Burn this. Ah, she did not burn it. She read it 4 times, and then she folded it very small, and then she put it inside her bodice against her heart, where no one in that house would ever think to look, because no one in that house had ever thought her worth the searching. And for the first time since the orangery, standing in the smell of hay and horses with a duke's letter warming against her skin, Ianthe Wenlock felt something rise in her that she had not felt in a very long time, and it took her a moment to know it for what it was. It was hope. And under the hope, harder and colder and more useful, something that's almost the first faint stirring of a woman's own anger on her own behalf, not the grief of being wronged, but the beginning of the resolve to see the wrong answered. She had spent her life being grateful. She discovered, extremely tired of it. That evening at dinner, when Sir Osric proposed cheerfully that the wedding might be brought forward to the Tuesday, since the bishop's man be had and the weather was fine, Ianthe set down her spoon, pressed the back of her hand to her brow, and said in a voice of soft and perfect distress that she feared her nerves would not bear the hurry, that a bride must have her 3 days, that she begged her dear uncle's indulgence for a foolish girl's weakness. And Sir Osric, who could no more read the steel under his niece's meekness than he could read Greek, patted her hand and told her to be easy, and the wedding stayed on Thursday, and Ianthe lowered her eyes to her plate so that no one at that table should see what was in them. Thursday, 3 days. A great deal may be undone in 3 days. She had bought her ally his time. She did not yet know what he meant to do with it. But she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she trusted him to do it, this cold, unlucky stranger who had seen her at her lowest and, alone of all the world, had looked at her as though she were worth the saving. The Duke of Renden did not go hunting for Lucien Ferras's secrets. He did not need to hunt for them. He had only to make it known, through the quiet channels that a man of his consequence commands, that he took an interest in Mr. Ferras's affairs, and the secrets came to him, as such things always do, carried by men who owed the Duke money and were glad of a way to be useful to him. By the second day he knew the shape of it entire. Lucien Ferras was not the comfortable, independent gentleman he presented to the county. He was a man drowning quietly in debt, and had been for 2 years, debts of play, debts to tailors and jewellers and worse, debts he had held off with charm and promises and the borrowing of one sum to smother another, in the way of men who cannot stop and dare not be still. He had courted Mrs. Sabine Farley first, in earnest, for the widow was believed to be rich, and had discovered, too late and to his fury, that her wealth was as much a fiction as his own, that she was as deep in the same waters as he, and that the two of them were bound together, now less by passion than by the desperate loyalty of fellow fugitives. And so he had turned to Ianthe Wenlock, not because he wanted her, because her uncle, Sir Osric, had settled upon the marriage a sum in ready money, a sum that Ferrers meant to have in his hands within a month of the wedding, and that would, if he could reach it, buy him just enough time to keep the whole tottering edifice of his life standing a little longer. It was, the Duke reflected, a perfectly ordinary villainy. There was nothing operatic in it. Ferrers was not a monster. He was merely a weak and frightened man who had chosen, when the ground gave under him, to save himself by climbing onto a woman who trusted him and using her as a raft. That was the commonest cruelty in the world, and the Duke of Rendon had watched it done 100 times to 100 women, and had, to his shame, held his peace at 99 of them, because they were not his affair, because a man cannot right every wrong, because it was the way of things. He was very tired of the way of things. You could simply pay his debts, Lady Marian observed, and have the notes assigned to yourself and hold them over him. It would be quicker. It would, the Duke agreed, and it would leave him whole, only leashed. I do not want him leashed, Marian. A leashed dog is still a dog and still bites when the leash slips. I want him gone. I want him gone in such a manner that Miss Wenlock is not touched by the going, that when the county tells this story, and it will tell it for years, she is the woman well rid of a scoundrel, and not the woman a duke made a scandal over. Those are two different stories, and only one of them lets her live. And how do you propose to write the first and not the second? By making certain, said the Duke, that Ferrers ruins himself in public, in his own words, before witnesses, without my hand ever seen upon it. A man that frightened, that far in debt, that certain of his own cleverness, he does not need pushing over the edge. He needs only to be brought to a place where the edge is, and given rope, and trusted to hang himself. I have known the type all my life. They cannot resist explaining how clever they have been. It is the one weakness the cunning never lose. The place, as it fell out, was Lady Ashcombe's card party. It was the last great gathering of the neighbourhood before the Wenlock wedding. A crowded, glittering evening of tables and candles and gossip, and the whole county would be there, and the Wenlocks and Ferrers, and Mrs. Farley, and the Duke of Rendon, who had not accepted a private invitation in 3 years, and whose acceptance of this one sent a small delighted shock through every drawing-room within a day's ride. That the cold Duke should suddenly emerge from his fastness the very week of a wedding he had no part in. The matrons made what they could of it, and made a great deal, and none of them came within a mile of the truth. Ianthe saw him the moment he entered the room. She had not known he would be there. She had spent the days since his letter in a strange suspended patience, going through the motions of a bride, standing for the last fitting of a gown she prayed she would never wear, and telling herself a dozen times an hour not to hope. Not to lean her whole weight on the word of a man she had spoken to once in the dark. And then the double doors opened, and the footman announced him, and the Duke of Rendon came into Lady Ashcombe's blaze of candles, tall and dark and unhurried, in plain and perfect black, with that stillness about him that made the bright chattering room seem suddenly a little cheap, and his eyes found hers across the whole length of it, at once, as though he had known precisely where she would be standing. He did not come to her. She understood, after the first leap of her heart, that he must not, that everything depended on their being strangers in that room. But he had looked at her, once deliberately, and in the look there had been something that steadied her more than any word could have done. It said, I am here. It is begun. Hold still. So she held still, and she watched. She watched the Duke of Rendon move through the party like weather, greeting his hostess with grave courtesy, exchanging a word here and there, declining the card tables with a small shake of the head, and she watched him drift, by degrees so gradual that no one but she was tracking them, toward the corner where Lucian Ferrers stood laughing among the younger men, expansive and easy, the bridegroom of the hour. And she watched Ferras's face when he realized the Duke of Rendon had stopped beside him and meant to speak. She was too far to hear the words. She did not need to hear them. She read the whole scene in the bodies of the men, as she had learned to read every room she had ever stood unregarded in the corner of. She saw Ferras's delight, the fool's delight of a small climbing man singled out by a great one. She saw the Duke say something light, some remark about the tables, the play, the fashionable habit of high stakes. She saw Ferrers, flattered, lower his guard and answer, and warm to it, and boast. She could see the boasting in the set of his shoulders, the man who could not resist showing a duke that he too moved in the world of consequence, that he too knew what it was to wager and to win. And she saw the duke listen, grave and encouraging and terrible, drawing the man out the way a fisherman draws line, giving him rope, agreeing, admiring, asking one more idle question and then one more. She could not have said afterward exactly what was done to Lucien Ferrers at Lady Ashcombe's party. Very little on the surface. A duke had spoken kindly to a gentleman about cards, and the gentleman had talked too much, as vain men do, and had let fall, before the duke, before 2 or 3 of the county's most reliable gossips whom the duke had somehow arranged to have standing near, a great deal more about his manner of living, his habits of play, his intimate acquaintance with certain money-lenders, than a prudent man on the eve of a respectable marriage should ever have let fall. He had thought he was impressing a duke. He had been, in truth, digging in the presence of witnesses, with his own tongue for a spade. There was one moment in the middle of it that Ianthe would keep for the rest of her life. Mrs. Sabine Farley had come to the card party in triumphant looks, gowned past her means, secure in her secret, and at one point in the evening she found herself, by some current of the room, standing near Ianthe by the long windows, and she could not resist. She turned to the plain little bride-to-be with a smile like sugared vinegar and said low, so that only Ianthe should hear, "You must be very happy, Miss Wenlock. Mr. Ferrers is such a catch. However did a girl like you contrive to hold him?" And Ianthe, who 3 days before would have flushed and stammered and looked at the floor, looked instead directly into the widow's handsome false face, held her eyes as the duke had held hers across the orangery, and said gently, with a composure that came from somewhere new and cold and entirely her own, "I did not contrive anything, Mrs. Farley. I do not think I hold him at all. I think a man may be borrowed for a time by any number of people, and belong to none of them, and imagine himself very clever, right up until the day the loan is called." And she smiled and turned back to the room, and left the widow standing there with the smile stuck to her face, and the first cold worm of a doubt working into her, for it is a terrible thing to a schemer, to catch a glimpse of intelligence in the eyes of the person she has counted upon to see nothing. Across the room, the Duke of Renden, who missed very little, had seen the exchange though he could not hear it, and had seen the widow's face change, and though his own expression did not alter by a hair, something in him that had been merely resolved became, in that instant, something warmer and more dangerous. He had come to Lady Ashcombe's to answer an injustice. He had not expected to watch the wronged woman begin, quietly, with no weapon but her own recovered dignity, to answer it herself. It moved him more than any tears could have done. A woman who wept he might have pitied. A woman who lifted her chin and returned a schemer's dart with a truth wrapped in courtesy. That woman he could not pity and did not want to. That woman he could only admire, and want to stand beside, and it was becoming, hour by hour, a good deal harder to pretend otherwise even to himself. By the end of the evening the tenor of the room had shifted. Ianthe felt it the way one feels a change of wind. Nothing was said aloud, but a certain matron looked at Ferrers a moment too long over her fan. A certain gentleman who had meant to invest with him found himself, on reflection, disinclined. The word debts had entered the room's water, and would spread through it by morning, as such words do, carried mouth to mouth until the whole county held a suspicion it could not name the source of, and the Duke of Renden, having lit the fire, took his leave of Lady Ashcombe early, gravely, without ever once approaching the Wenlock party, and on his way to the door he passed within 3 feet of Ianthe, and did not look at her, and said, very low, so quietly that she felt the words more than heard them, and no one else heard them at all, "Hold to Thursday. Trust the day. Whatever you are asked to do before the church, do not sign and do not swear, and do not let them hurry you. It is nearly done." And then he was gone, and Ianthe was left standing in the candlelight with her heart going like a struck bell, understanding that she had just watched a man she had been taught to fear take the first stone out of the wall of her prison, so quietly that the men who had built the wall did not yet know it was falling. That night, for the first time, she did not weep. She sat at the window of her cold small room and looked out at the dark toward where she thought Renden must lie, and she found that the grief she had carried since the orangery had changed its nature. It was still there, but it had hardened into something with an edge and a direction. She was done being the woman things were done to. She had watched, tonight, how a wrong might be answered, patiently, coldly, without a single voiced, and she thought, I could learn that. I would like to learn that. And under the thought, quiet and new and a little frightening, was the beginning of a question she did not yet dare to finish. What manner of man was the Duke of Rendon, that he should spend his consequence and his patience and his cold, clever anger on a portionless stranger, who could give him nothing in return? And why, when she thought of him now, did the thought not frighten her at all, but warm her, like a coal held in both hands against the cold? In his own house, 11 miles away, the Duke of Rendon sat late over a single glass he did not drink, and asked himself very nearly the same question, and liked his answer to it a good deal less easily than she would have liked hers. He had told his sister it was justice. It was justice. But he had stood in that bright room tonight, and felt the girl's eyes on him from across it, and had known himself watched by her with a trust so complete it frightened him, and he had understood that he was no longer acting only out of justice. He was acting out of something he had sworn, after the ruin of his youth, that he would never let himself feel again, because the last time he had felt it, it had been taken from him, and the taking had very nearly killed him. He was falling in love with Ianthe Wenlock, and he had 2 days to save her from another man before he could even begin to reckon what that was going to cost them both. The Wednesday brought rain and a crisis, and the crisis brought them, at last, into the same room alone. The rain the Duke had not planned, the crisis he had. By Wednesday morning the whispers he had loosed at Lady Ashcombe's party had done their work. The word of Ferrers's debts had reached the ears it needed to reach, and one of those ears belonged to a certain Mr. Pruitt, a hard-eyed man of business to whom Ferrers owed a great deal, and who had been content to wait only so long as he believed his debtor was about to marry money. The moment Mr. Pruitt heard it, whispered that the Wenlock settlement might be so secure as supposed, a whisper the Duke had taken particular care that Mr. Pruitt should hear. He grew a great deal less content to wait. He wrote to Ferrers. He hinted at things. He spoke of calling in what was owed, and of doing so, if need be, before witnesses, in a manner that would end the marriage and the man together. Ferrers, cornered, did the thing cornered men do. He went to Sir Osric and pressed, with all his charm turned up to its brightest, to have the wedding money advanced, some part of it, any part of it, before the ceremony rather than after, on this pretext or that. And Sir Osric, who was practical but not a fool, grew thoughtful, and the household, which had been all bridal ease, grew suddenly uneasy, and Ianthe, in the middle of it, was told that she must go that afternoon with her aunt to sign a paper at the attorney's in the town, a small matter, a formality, nothing to trouble her head over. Only her mark was wanted to make the advance regular. Do not sign, the Duke had written, and at Lady Ashcombe's, do not sign, and do not swear, and do not let them hurry you. Ianthe pleaded illness. She pleaded it with a conviction born of real terror, for she understood, as her uncle did not, exactly what her signature on that paper would purchase and for whom. She took to her bed with a headache no one could disprove, and she lay there through the long grey afternoon listening to the rain and the muffled anxious voices below, and she prayed with a directness she had not managed in years, that the cold Duke's patience had not run out one day too soon. It had not. Toward dusk, a closed carriage she did not recognize came up the Harcombe drive, and a servant came to say that Lady Marian Vaux had called, the Duke of Rendon's sister, no less, and had asked most particularly whether Miss Wenlock was well enough to receive a short visit. Having heard the poor girl was indisposed and wishing to bring her a tincture that had done wonders for her own nerves. It was so gracious, so unexpected, so flattering an attention from so great a family, that Sir Osric's household fell over itself to admit her, and Lady Marian swept in, all warmth and consequence, and was shown up to the sick room and asked, with perfect naturalness, that she might sit a little while with the invalid quite alone, for she had found that a quiet feminine word did more for a nervous headache than all the tinctures in the world. And when the door was closed, and the aunt's footsteps had faded down the passage, Lady Marian crossed to the window, drew the curtain a careful inch, and said, "My brother is below in the lane, in the rain, and he will not come up, for it would ruin you if he were found here. But he wished you to have the choosing of what comes next, and he did not think it right to choose it for you through a letter. Will you come down to the carriage? 10 minutes. I shall sit here in your place with a book, and if anyone comes I am reading to you and you are sleeping. Will you come? Iantha was already reaching for her shawl. The lane behind the Harcombe stables was dark and streaming, and the closed carriage stood under the dripping elms with its lamps hooded, and when the door opened and she climbed up into the close, dry dimness of it, the Duke of Rendon was there, hatless, the rain still bright in his dark hair, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. It was the first time they had been alone since the terrace. It felt entirely different and entirely the same. You did not sign, he said. I took to my bed instead. I have discovered a great talent for headaches. It seems a useful thing to have learned. Her voice was not quite steady. Your sister is very kind. You are, your grace. I do not know how to speak to you. You have spent 3 days spending yourself upon a stranger, and I have nothing to give you for it, and I cannot even understand why you should, a man like you, a girl like me. It makes no sense, and I have lain up there all afternoon frightened half to death and unable to stop trusting you, and I do not know whether I am the greatest fool in the county or— She stopped. I do not know what I am. I have not known since Sunday. You unmade all my certainties in the dark, and you have not given me new ones. Then let me give you one. He said it quietly, and he did not reach for her, though she saw him want to. He kept his hands still upon his knees, a proper foot of dark rainy air between them, because he was a man who had learned to hold still, and because he would not, of all things, be another man who used her trust against her. By this hour tomorrow you will not marry Lucian Ferrers. It is done, Miss Wenlock, or as good as. His creditors have found him. His widow's fortune was always a fiction as his own is. His debts are known. The story of him is loose in the county and cannot be recalled. Your uncle will discover, tomorrow morning if not tonight, that he was about to give his money and his niece to a bankrupt fraud, and no practical man on this earth will hold to such a bargain once he sees it plainly. The marriage will break of its own weight, and you will have been touched by none of it. The man ruined himself. You are merely the fortunate woman spared. That is the story the county will tell. I have taken some pains to be certain it is the only one they can. She sat very still in the swaying dimness, taking it in. And Mr. Ferrers? Answered, said the Duke, and there was in the single word a cold finality that told her more than a speech would have. Not by me, by himself, and by the men he owes, and by the world he lied to, which does not forgive a man for being found out nearly so readily as it forgives him for being poor. He will not recover from this, Miss Wenlock, not his purse and not his name. He wagered both on the belief that you were a thing without spirit that would never look up and never be looked at, and he has lost both, and he does not yet know it. Tomorrow he will. I should feel triumphant, she said slowly. I find I only feel tired, and a little sorry, which frightens me. Not for him, for the girl I was on Sunday morning who was going to be married, and thought herself lucky and did not know. Do not be sorry for her. His voice roughened, low. She was braver than she knew, that girl, and she has grown into something braver still in 4 days. I have watched her do it. I would not have her sorry for a moment of it. Iantha looked at him then in the hooded lamplight, at the hard grave face, the rain still glinting at his temples, the stillness that she had first taken for coldness and now understood for something else entirely. Something held down hard because it had once been let loose and had cost too much. And she asked him the thing she had wondered for 3 days. Why, she said gently, and do not tell me justice, your grace, for I've felt the shape of what you have done, and no man spends this much of himself on pure justice for a stranger. Why me? The Duke of Rendon was quiet for a long moment. The rain drummed on the carriage roof. And then, because she had asked him plainly, and because he found he could not lie to the one person in the world who had looked at him without fear, he told her the thing he had told no one but his sister in 20 years. When I was younger than you are now, he said, my family arranged for me a marriage of great advantage. I did not love the lady, she did not love me. We were both sold, and we both knew it, and we were both too proud and too young and too well trained to refuse. She loved another man, a poor one, unsuitable, exactly the sort a family forbids. I knew it. I married her anyway, because it was arranged, because it was the way of things, because I told myself she would come to be content. She did not come to be content. She was miserable, and I was helpless to mend it, and the thing that was between her and the man she truly wanted did not die because we had buried it. It never does, and in the end it destroyed her. She died young, Miss Wenlock, of a fever that a woman with something to live for might have fought, and did not fight, and the county has whispered ever since that there was something dark in the house of Renden, and they are not wrong, though it was not the darkness they imagine. The darkness was that I stood by at 19 and let a girl be sold into a marriage that killed her, because everyone told me it was prudent, and I did not have the courage to say no. He looked up at her, and his eyes in the lamplight were the eyes of a man laying down at last, a thing he had carried a very long way. So you ask me why. I will tell you why. Because on Sunday I stood in an orangery and watched it beginning again. A girl sold, a girl told to be grateful, a girl about to be handed to a man who did not want her for anything but her uses, and everyone around her calling it prudence. And I found that I could stand by once. I could not stand by twice. I could not live in a world where I had done it twice. That is your why, Miss Wenlock, and it is not a pretty one, and it is not, I am aware, entirely about you. But it became about you. Somewhere in these 3 days it stopped being the old ghost and became your grey eyes, and I have not yet made my peace with how completely, and I did not intend to say so tonight, and I have said it, and there it is. For a while neither of them spoke. The rain filled the silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but the particular deep quiet of two people who have each just set down a burden they had carried alone too long and are each surprised to find the other still there. I have never told anyone that, he said at last, low. Not in 20 years. My sister knows the facts of it. She does not know the weight of it, the way it sits on a man. I did not mean to tell you. I meant to be your ally and keep my distance and see you safely out of Farah's hands and then step back and let you have your life, unburdened by mine, which is no gift to anyone. And instead I have sat in a dark carriage and handed a portionless girl I have known 4 days the one thing I have never given a living soul. I do not know what that means, except that I do not seem able to help it, and that I have stopped in the last hour, being sorry for it. I am glad you told me, Yantha said. Do you know why? Because for 4 days you have been the strong one, the clever one, the one arranging everything from behind a curtain, the Duke of Renden who is to be feared. And I have been the one being rescued, which is a strange and not entirely comfortable thing to be, however grateful. And now you have told me that you carry a grief as heavy as mine and older, and that you have carried it alone. Sir, I find I am not frightened of you at all. I am something else. I do not have the word for it yet, but it is the opposite of frightened, and it began the moment you stopped being a duke and became a man who was sorry 20 years too late that he had not been braver. She paused. You are being braver now. I hope you know that. Whatever comes of it, you are being braver now than you were at 19, and it is not too late, and it does not undo the old wrong, but it answers it. I think that is all any of us can do with the wrongs we did not stop. We cannot unmake them. We can only refuse to make them twice. The Duke was quiet. Then he said, roughly as though the words cost him, You are a remarkable woman, Yantha Wenlock. I do not think anyone has ever told you so. I think a great many people have spent 20 years making very sure you did not find it out. They were fools, every one of them, and I mean before I am done to see the whole county know it. Yantha Wenlock sat in the dark of the carriage and looked at the Duke of Renden, and she felt the last of her fear of him go out of her entirely, and something far larger and far more dangerous come in to fill the place where it had been. She did not say she loved him. It was too soon, and she was too honest, and the word had been so lately dirtied in her mouth by a man who used it to mean nothing. But she reached across the foot of rainy air between them slowly, so that he might have drawn back if he wished, and he did not draw back. And she laid her bare hand over his where it rested, clenched upon his knee, and she felt him go utterly still under the touch as though he did not dare to move for fear of breaking it. Then we are two people, she said softly, who have each been sold once, and have each decided we will not stand by while it is done again. That is not nothing, your grace. That may, in fact, be a great deal more than most marriages are built upon. I am not saying anything else tonight. I am too newly free even to know what I want, but I am saying that, and I am meaning it, and I would have you carry it home with you through the rain. The Duke turned his hand beneath hers, slowly, until their palms were together, and he held her hand once, briefly hard, the way a drowning man holds the one thing that floats. Then he let it go, because he was a man of honor and she was not yet free, and to hold it a moment longer than that would have been to become, in some small way, the thing he despised. "Go up," he said low, "before you are missed. Tomorrow the walls come down. Be ready." "And Miss Wenlock," she paused half out the carriage door into the rain, "whatever is said in that house tomorrow, whatever is done, hold to what you saw in the orangery, and hold to what I have told you tonight, and hold to Thursday. It is very nearly over. And when it is over, I should like, if you find, when you are truly free, that you should like it too, to begin something with you that no one has arranged for either of us, and that no one may take away. But that is for a free woman to choose. Tomorrow I make you free. What you do with it after is yours, and only yours, and I will abide by it whatever it costs me." She looked back at him once through the rain, and she did not answer in words, because there were no words yet that would not either say too little or promise too much. But she smiled at him, the first true smile he had seen on her face in the whole of their strange acquaintance, small and wet and unguarded and alive, and it was answer enough to carry an iron man 11 miles home through the dark, and did. The Duke had believed the marriage would break of its own weight. He had reckoned without the peculiar courage of a cornered man and the peculiar cowardice of a respectable one, and by the grey of Thursday morning he understood that he had made the one error a careful man most dreads. He had been right about everything except how the other men would choose to behave. The truth had reached Sir Osric Wenlock. That much had gone as the Duke intended. Late on Wednesday night a letter had come from Mr. Prewitt, blunt and businesslike, informing Sir Osric as a matter of common fairness that the gentleman about to marry his niece stood upon the edge of ruin, owed sums that the writer could enumerate, and had lately sought to advance the marriage settlement for reasons the writer left to Sir Osric's imagination. It was everything the Duke had wished Sir Osric to know. He had assumed that a practical man, once he knew it, would draw the practical conclusion and break the match. He had not reckoned on the wedding being 7 hours away, and 200 guests invited, and the wedding breakfast already laid, and Sir Osric Wenlock being a man who feared the ridicule of his neighbours a great deal more than he feared doing wrong by a niece he had never much regarded. For when Sir Osric, grey with fury and fright, confronted Lucian Ferrers with the letter at first light, Ferrers did not crumble. Ferrers had spent his whole life talking his way off the edges of cliffs, and he talked now for his life, and he was very good at it. It was slander, he said, the jealous invention of a money-lender he had refused to be bled by, a common creditor's trick to frighten a family into paying what was not owed. Debts. A gentleman had debts. Every gentleman of spirit had debts. Did Sir Osric imagine a man reached his years without them? The widow Farley was a friend of his late mother's and nothing more, and shame upon the low minds that made her innocent kindness into scandal. And as for advancing the settlement, why, he had thought only to spare Sir Osric the tedium of it later, to have all in order before the wedding journey. Was a bridegroom to be hanged for wishing his affairs neat? And then he played the card that cornered men keep for the last. If Sir Osric broke the match now, this morning, with the church filled and the county watching, think, he urged, of what would be said, not of him, of her, of Miss Wenlock. A bride cast off at the very door of the church, 200 tongues that would ask why, the certainty, whatever the truth, that some part of the shame would stick to the girl and never come off. A jilted woman was a spoiled woman. The county did not trouble itself with justice, it troubled itself with blood. Break the match and Sir Osric saved his money and destroyed his niece and made his family the byword of 3 parishes for a generation. Or go through with it, quietly this once, and settle the matter of the debts privately afterward, man to man, as gentlemen did, and no one need ever know that anything had been wrong at all. It was a monstrous argument, and it was a clever one, and it worked, because it offered a frightened man the thing frightened men most want, which is a way to do the cowardly thing and call it kindness. By 8 o'clock Sir Osric had persuaded himself that the safest course, the course that protected the family, protected the niece, protected the sacred smoothness of appearances, was to let the wedding proceed, and have the reckoning with Ferrers after, when the guests were gone and the money could be argued over out of the world's sight. They did not tell Ianthe any of it. They told her only that she must dress, that the hour was come, that the carriages were ordered. And when she looked into her aunt's face and saw there something taut and false and unhappy, and asked plainly whether anything was the matter, she was told briskly that a bride's nerves were the matter and nothing else, and that she must not be foolish, and that she would be at the church by 10. Ianthe understood then that the walls the Duke had promised to bring down had not come down, or had come down somewhere out of her sight, in some room she was not admitted to, among men deciding her life without her, and had been propped up again, because the men found the ruin of a girl more convenient than the ruin of their own dignity. She stood in her cold, small room in the wedding gown they laced her into, white and stiff and hateful against her skin, and she felt the old helplessness reach up for her out of the floor like water rising in a locked cellar. And for one terrible moment she believed the whole of the last 4 days had been a dream she had told herself, and that there'd never been any duke in any orangery, and that girls like her were married to men like Ferrers, 'cause that was what girls like her were for. And then she put her hand to her bodice, where a folded letter still lay warm against her heart, and she felt its edges, and she remembered a hand turning beneath hers in a dark carriage, and a low rough voice saying, "Tomorrow the walls come down, be ready." And she lifted her chin, the way she had lifted it in the orangery, the way she had taught herself to lift it out of deep water, and she thought, "He does not know. Whatever has been decided in whatever room, he does not know they mean to carry me to the church anyway. He believed it broken. He is not coming, because he thinks there is nothing left to come for." She had to get word to him, and she had, between the lacing of her gown and the calling of the carriages, perhaps a quarter of an hour, and not one soul in that house she could trust, except one. The groom in the stable yard, the man who'd put the Duke's first letter into her hand and been paid to forget it. She did not know if he could be trusted twice. She knew only that she had no other card to play, and that a woman who will not play her last card deserves to lose. She pleaded to her aunt, a bride's foolish wish for a breath of air before the ordeal, a moment in the garden, only a moment she would not muss the gown, and the aunt, harried and guilty and glad of any small mercy she could grant the girl she was helping to betray, allowed it. And Ianthe went out into the wet bright morning in her white gown, around by the yew hedge, quick, to the corner of the stable yard where the groom was harnessing the wedding horses, and she caught his eye, and she saw in his weathered face that he knew. That the whole house of servants knew what the family had decided and had their own low opinion of it, and she understood in that instant that the sympathy of servants is a current that runs beneath every great house, and is never once consulted by the people who own it. "You carried a letter for me," she said low and fast, "on Sundenden. I have no time and no money and no right to ask, but I am asking. Ride to the Duke, now, before the church. Tell him they mean to marry me anyway, that my uncle was frightened and Mr. Ferrers talked him round, and they are taking me to St. Ewald's at 10 whatever he was told. Tell him the walls did not come down. Tell him," her voice caught and steadied, "tell him I held to Thursday and Thursday did not hold, and if he meant any of what he said in the rain, the time to mean it is now. Can you do it, will you?" The groom looked at her, a portionless girl in a wedding gown she plainly hated, asking a servant to gallop against her own family, and something in his hard face shifted, and he wiped his hands on his breeches and said, "There's a hunter in the 3rd box could do the 11 mile in the half of an hour, miss." And Sir Osric may whistle for who saddled him, and he was up and gone, out the back of the yard and over the paddock rail, and aways the wet fields at a dead run, no saddle, the mud flying up behind him, riding for Renden as though the girl's whole life went with him, which it did. Ianthe stood a moment in the empty yard with her heart slamming and the rain-washed morning very bright and very still around her. Then she smoothed the hateful white gown, and she composed her face into the meek blank mask that kept her safe her whole life. And she walked back around the yew hedge to where her aunt was calling her name, and she let them hand her up into the wedding carriage, and she folded her gloved hands in her lap, and she rode toward the church of St. Ewald to be married to a man who had called her a face-maid for a governess, holding, with everything she had, to the single wild hope that 11 miles away a cold, unlucky Duke was pulling on his boots. The drive to St. Ewald was the longest journey of Ianthe Wenlock's life, though it covered less than 3 miles. Her aunt sat across from her in the swaying carriage, talking of nothing, the flowers, the weather, the number of carriages already on the road, talking, Ianthe understood, to fill the silence, because her aunt was not a wicked woman, only a weak one, and weak people cannot bear a silence in which they might have to hear their own conscience. Ianthe let her talk. She watched the wet hedgerows go by, and she counted and she prayed, and she made herself a promise that steadied her more than any prayer. She promised herself that whatever happened at the church, whether the Duke came or did not come, whether the groom reached him in time or was thrown in a ditch or turned back, she would not say the word yes. She had said yes once, on the terrace of Harcombe, without knowing she was saying it, when she agreed to a marriage arranged for her by frightened men. She would not say it a second time to a man she had watched betray her. If the Duke came, she would go with him gladly. If he did not, she would stand at the altar of St. Ewald and say no plainly before God and the county, and let the ruin fall where it fell, and be a jilting scandal all her life, and prefer it, infinitely prefer it, to one more hour of being carried. That was the thing 4 days had given her that 20 years had not a rescuer, a refusal. She had found at last the one word that had always been hers to say, and had never once been offered to her as a thing she was allowed to say, and she held it now in her mouth like a coin, ready whatever came. It was a strange kind of peace, and it lasted her all the way to the churchyard gate. At the church the bells were ringing, and the carriages were arriving, and the county was pouring in under its umbrellas, in its silks and its curiosity, 200 strong, filling the old grey nave with the rustle and murmur of a great occasion. Lucien Ferrers stood already at the chancel step in a new blue coat, handsome and easy and smiling, receiving the good wishes of people who did not yet know he was ruined, and he watched the doors for his bride with the calm of a man who believes he has won. He had talked Sir Osric round. He had talked the whole county round. In an hour he would have a wife and a claim upon her uncle's money, and time enough, with the money in hand, to talk his creditors round too, the way he had talked everyone round his whole charmed life. He did not once look toward the road from Rendon. He had no reason to. He did not know there was anything on it, coming hard, that could not be talked round at all. The groom on the unsaddled hunter reached Rendon with his lungs burning and the horse blowing foam, and the Duke of Rendon, who had believed his work finished, and had been standing at his window since dawn in a black stillness he could not explain, came down his own steps 2 at a time at the first sight of the muddy rider, and had the whole of it out of the man in the time it took a groom of his own to bring his fastest horse. They mean to marry her anyway. So Osric was frightened. Ferrers talked him round. 10 o'clock, City Wolds, whatever you were told. She said to tell you she held to Thursday, and Thursday did not hold. She said the time to mean it is now. The Duke was in the saddle before the sentence was finished. 11 miles. He had ridden them in the rain 3 nights before at a walk, thinking. He rode them now as he had not ridden since he was a young man with nothing left to lose, low over the horse's neck, taking the hedges and the flooded fords and the long streaming fields at a pace that would have killed a lesser rider or a lesser horse. And he did not think at all, because there was nothing left to think. He had done all his thinking. There remained only the getting there, and the bells of St. Ewald beginning, very faint and very far, to ring across the wet green country ahead of him. He did not know, riding, whether he would be in time. He did not let himself think of it. He had learned long ago that a man who fills his mind with the picture of failing arrives already half defeated, and so he emptied his mind of everything but the next hedge, the next ford, the next mile, and the low certainty underneath it all that whatever waited at St. Ewald, he would meet it as himself. If she had already spoken the vows, he would still speak the truth. A marriage built on the fraud he could prove would not survive the proving, and he would see it annulled though it took him a year and every friend he had in the law. If she had not yet spoken, he would stop it in the aisle. Either way he would not, this time, be the man who arrived too late and stood by. He had been that man once. He had ridden 11 miles to be sure he was never that man again, and the horse under him seemed to understand it, and gave him everything it had, and the grey country tore past, and the far bells rang, and the Duke of Rendon bent lower and rode. He thought once of her face on the terrace the first night, the way she had bowed to him in the dark with her whole world in ruins, and asked him for nothing. He thought of her hand turning under his in the rain. He thought, I am coming, hold to Thursday 1 hour more, I am coming. And though she could not hear it, 11 miles ahead of him, walking up an aisle she did not want to walk, she was thinking almost the same words in the other direction, and the two thoughts crossed somewhere over the wet fields between them like birds flying home. In the church, the bride had come. Ianthe walked up the long aisle of St. Ewald on her uncle's arm through the turned faces of 200 people, and she did not look to left or right, and she held her chin level out of deep water, and she counted her steps. And she listened under the murmuring and the organ and the ringing of the bells for the sound of a horse. She did not hear one. She reached the chancel step, and Sir Osric gave her hand into the keeping of the man she had watched with his mouth against another woman's throat. And Lucien Ferrers smiled down at her, that warm, easy, hateful, victorious smile, and murmured, "You look very well, my dear." And she looked back at him with a face he could not read and thought, with a calm that surprised her, "I see you. You do not know it yet, but I see you, and somewhere on the road there is a man who sees you too. And if he does not come, I will say the word no in this church before God and all your 200 witnesses, and let the ruin fall where it falls, because I am done being carried. I am done." But she did not have to say it, because as the clergyman opened his book and drew breath, the bells outside faltered and broke off, ragged, and a sound came up the aisle from the great west door that was not the sound of a wedding, a sound of the door thrown wide, and boots on stone, and a voice that filled the whole grey vault of the church without once being raised above the pitch of command. Stopped the service. 200 faces turned. Ianthe turned with them, and her heart went up into her throat and stayed there. The Duke of Rendon stood in the west door of St. Ewald with the grey morning at his back, mud to the knee, his dark hair wild with the ride, the rain still on him, and he did not look wild. That was the terrible thing, and the magnificent one. He looked, standing there, more entirely himself than any man in the church, still and certain and cold as iron, and he came up the long aisle through the parting, murmuring, scandalized crowd at an unhurried pace that was somehow more frightening than any run, and behind him, Ianthe saw it now, came 2 other men in sober dark clothes, and one of them was the hard-eyed Mr. Pruitt with a leather folder under his arm, and the county's whisper rose around them all like a tide coming in. Your Grace, the clergyman, poor man, did not know what to do with a duke in his aisle. This is, sir, this is a marriage. You cannot, I can, and I will, and when you have heard me you will thank me for it. The duke had reached the chancel step. He did not look at the clergyman. He looked at Lucien Ferrers, and Ferrers, who 3 days before had let a duke draw him out over the cards, had gone the colour of tallow. "Forgive me, Miss Wenlock." He said it low and only to her, and for one instant the iron gentled, and she saw the man from the carriage in the rain. "I believed it finished. I was wrong. I will not be wrong twice." Then he straightened and turned to the church and raised his voice at last, not to a shout, but to the full grave-carrying pitch of a man born to be obeyed, so that the farthest pew heard every word. "My name is known to most of you. You know I do not meddle. You know I do not go into company, and that I have not spoken 20 words in public in 3 years, and that I would sooner cut off my hand than stand where I am standing now and make a spectacle of myself before the whole of this county. Mark that, all of you, and ask yourselves what would bring such a man to break up a wedding in the open church. I will tell you what. The truth, and the fact that no one else in this building will speak it, and this lady's whole life hanging upon its being spoken before that ring goes on to her hand." He turned back to Ferrers. "This man," said the Duke of Rendon, "is bankrupt, not embarrassed. Not temporarily inconvenienced, as every gentleman claims to be. Ruined. He owes more than he can ever pay to half the money-lenders of 2 counties, and he has kept himself afloat these 2 years by charm and by fresh debt and by lies. And when the water finally rose to his chin, he looked about for a raft, and he chose Miss Ianthe Wenlock, not because he wanted her, not for one honest hour, but because her uncle had settled ready money upon the marriage, money that this man meant to have in his hands among his creditors within the month. He courted her for it. He deceived her for it. He stood at this altar this morning to steal it, and to spend the rest of a portionless woman's life as the price of his own comfort, and he keeps a mistress in the bargain, whom some of you have seen and none of you have named. I do not ask you to take my word. Mr. Pruitt, who is owed by this gentleman a sum I will not shame him by naming aloud, has brought the accounts. They are here. They may be read by any man who doubts me in the vestry this hour. The church had gone utterly silent. Into the silence Mr. Pruitt, grim and precise, stepped forward and laid his leather folder open upon the very rail before the altar, and the pages of it, the notes, the dates, the figures, the whole cold arithmetic of a ruined man, lay there in the candlelight for Sir Osric Wenlock to see. And Sir Osric came forward with a face gone grey and old, and looked down at them, and put his hand to his mouth. Slander, Ferrers said, but the word came out cracked, and no one turned to him with belief. 200 people had watched the colour leave his face, and the county that had smiled at him an hour before was already, in the way of counties, deciding it had always known. This is, your grace, this is a private malice. I do not know what I have done to earn a great man's spite, but to shame me here before. You have earned nothing from me but the answer your own conduct wrote. The Duke's voice did not rise, and that was the worst of it. I bear you no malice, Mr. Ferrers. A man does not hate the fox for taking the hen. He only shoots it and thinks no more about it. You are answered because you were false, and because a woman who trusted you was about to pay for your falseness with her whole life, and because I stood by once, 20 years ago, and watched a thing like this done, and swore upon everything I had left that I would never stand by again. That is all. That is the whole of it. You are not important enough to hate. You are only important enough to stop. He turned from Ferrers as a man turns from a thing dealt with, and he looked at Ianthe, and the whole of the terrible cold command went out of his face. And what was under it was so plain and so unguarded that a soft sound ran through the watching church, the sound 200 people make when they understand, all at once, that they are seeing something true. Miss Wenlock, said the Duke of Rendenne, and now his voice was not for the church at all, though the church heard every word. I told you in the rain that I would make you free, and that what you did with your freedom after was yours, only yours, and I meant it, and I mean it still. You are free. It is done. This marriage is dead. No power in this county will lift it now, and you need never again be handed to any man by anyone for any reason as long as you live. That is yours, whatever you say next. I did not do it to be paid. So hear me plainly and believe that there is no chain upon your answer. He went down, the Duke of Rendenne, before 200 of the people who had feared and pitied and whispered over him for 20 years. Went down onto one knee upon the stone of the chancel step in his mud-stained riding clothes, and took the edge of the impossibility of it upon himself, and did not care. I am not a warm man. I am not a lucky one. I come to you with a hard name and a sad history, and a temper that my own sister does not always love, and I can promise you nothing except this, that I have watched you for 4 days meet the worst that could be done to you with a courage I have not seen the equal of in 40 years. And that I would spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside it, not to dispose of you, to stand beside you. Marry me, Ianthe, not because it is arranged, for nothing on this earth is less arranged than this, but because you choose it freely of your own will, the first thing in your whole life that has been only and entirely yours. Will you? And Ianthe Wenlock stood at the altar of St. Ewald in the white gown she had hated, between the man who had betrayed her and the man who had ridden 11 miles through the rain to answer him, with 200 faces turned up to her and her uncle grey and silent, and the bells fallen still. And she found that she was not afraid, and that she was not out of deep water any longer, and that the thing rising in her now was not helplessness at all, but its exact and opposite twin. She reached up, slowly, and drew the wreath and the veil from her own hair, and let them fall to the stone at Ferrers' feet, and she stepped over them, and crossed the little space of chancel that had held her whole life in the balance, and she put her bare hand, the same hand that had covered his in the dark of a carriage, into the hand of the Duke of Rendenne where he knelt, and she closed her fingers around it, hard the way a person holds the one thing in the world that floats. Yes, she said, not softly, clearly, so that the farthest pew should hear it, so that no one should ever be able to say she had been carried into this the way she had so nearly been carried into the other. Yes, freely, and of my own will, and the first thing in my life that has been only mine. Get up, Sal. You have been on your knees to no one for 20 years, and I will not have you begin with me. Get up and take me out of this church, and let it be the last time either of us is ever sold to anyone for anything." He rose to his full height, and he did not look at Ferrers again. That man had ceased, in the Duke's reckoning, to exist, and he did not make a speech, for the speech was made. He simply drew Ianthe's hand through his arm and settled it there, over his heart, and turned her toward the great west door and the grey light beyond it. And as he did, a thing happened in that church that no one had planned and no one afterward could quite account for. From somewhere in the crowded pews a single woman began to applaud, an old woman, as it happened, a widow of the parish who had herself been married for money 60 years before, and had buried the memory deep and never spoken of it to a soul, and after her another, and then a dozen, and then, in a slow gathering wave that rose to fill the whole grey vault of St. Ewald, the greater part of 200 people were on their feet, applauding, not the Duke, and not even quite the bride, but the plain miraculous fact of a wrong seen and named and answered in the open before it could be sealed. The thing that so rarely happens in this world that when it happens people hardly know what to do with their hands, and so they clap, because there is nothing else to do with a heart suddenly too full. Ianthe walked the length of that sound on the arm of the Duke of Rendenne with her head level and her eyes bright and dry, and she did not look at the faces, and she did not need to, for she had spent her whole life being looked through by rooms exactly like this one, and now, for the first and truest time, a room was on its feet for her, and she thought, with a calm that would stay with her all her days, that she would not trade the walk down that aisle free for 100 quiet weddings to 100 better-behaved men. It had cost her everything to get to it. It was worth everything it had cost. They walked out of St. Ewald together into a morning that had, while no one was attending to it, stopped raining. The Duke did not hurry her. That was the thing Ianthe would remember longest of that walk. That having ridden 11 miles at a killing pace to reach her, having thrown open the church and brought a man's whole life down in 10 minutes, he now gave her his arm and matched his long stride to hers, and walked her down the aisle at exactly the pace she chose, as though there were all the time in the world, as though nothing in the church behind them mattered in the least beside the steadiness of her hand upon his sleeve. 200 people rose as they passed. Some of them were ashamed, and some were merely thrilled, and a good many of the women, the ones who had themselves been handed to men they did not choose, and had made their peace with it, and had never once been offered a hand up out of it by anyone, looked at Ianthe Wenlock with something in their faces that was very close to grief, and very close to gladness, and could not have said which. Behind them, the ruin of Lucien Ferrers completed itself without any further help from the Duke. He had counted to the last on his charm, and he discovered at the altar of St. Ewald the one iron law that charming men forget, which is that charm is a loan, and the county had just called it in. The neighbours who had smiled at him an hour before now would not meet his eye. Mr. Pruitt closed his leather folder and remarked, in the flat carrying voice of a man of business who no longer needs to be polite, that he would trouble Mr. Ferrers for a word outside, and that the word would concern the settling of accounts, and that Mr. Ferrers would find him a great deal less patient than the ladies had been. Sir Osric Wenlock, grey and shaking, turned upon the man who had so nearly cost him his money and his niece and his name all at once, and said, in front of the whole assembled county, 3 sentences of such cold and final contempt that Ferrers never afterwards set foot in the parish again. And Mrs. Sabine Farley, who had come to the wedding to gloat in secret at the plain Wenlock creature's triumph and her own clever survival, sat frozen in her pew as the whole church learned in a single sentence exactly who she was and exactly what she was to the bankrupt at the altar. And she rose, and she went out by a side door, and she was not received in that county again either. The two of them had wagered a portionless woman's life on the belief that no one would ever look and be moved and act. They had been very nearly right. They had been undone by the one man in 40 years who would not at the last stand by, and by the girl herself, who had lifted her chin out of the water one time too many for them to hold her under. The Duke handed her up into his own carriage, which had come at last and got him beside her, and closed the door on the whole staring county, and as the horses drew them away from St. Ewald, Iantha Wenlock put her face into her two gloved hands and began, at last, to shake, not from grief, and not from fear, but from the enormous release of a thing held too long and too hard suddenly let go. He did not reach for her. He waited the way he had waited in the orangery, the way he had waited in the rain, giving her the whole of the moment to be entirely her own. And when she had done and lifted her face and wiped it, and looked at him with her weather-grey eyes gone bright and steady, he said only, "There now, it is over. You never have to do any of it again." She said, wondering, "That is the strangest part. I have been afraid for so long that I do not quite know how to be anything else. I keep waiting for the floor to give way, and it does not. You are simply here, and it does not. It will not," said the Duke of Rendon, "for as long as I am alive to see it does not. I am aware that is not a thing a wise woman takes on a man's word, so do not take it on my word. Take it on 4 days' evidence, and take the rest of your life to gather more, and hold me to every hour of it. I would rather be held to it than believed. Believing is cheap. I mean to be held." There was a reckoning in the weeks that followed, and Iantha was present for the part of it that mattered. Sir Osric came to Rendon, hat in hand, to make what amends a proud man can make when he has come within a sentence of selling his own blood. And he found the interview harder than any he had ever faced, because his niece received him with perfect gentleness and no anger at all, and there is nothing on earth so hard to bear as the gentleness of a person one has wronged and expected to rage. He tried to explain himself, the fear of scandal, the pressure of the moment, the belief, he said, that he had been acting for the best. And Iantha let him finish, and then she said quietly, "I know, uncle, you were frightened. I have been frightened my whole life, so I know exactly how it feels, and how small it makes a person, and how it whispers that the cowardly thing is really the kind one. I do not hate you for it. But I will tell you the one thing I have learned, in case it is of use to you, for you were not unkind to me, only blind, and blindness can be mended. It is this, that the people who cannot defend themselves are watching to see whether anyone will defend them, and they remember forever which people did and which people looked away. I looked away from myself for 20 years. A stranger taught me not to. I hope you will learn it sooner than I did, and cheaper." And Sir Osric went home a chastened and, in the end, a better man, and was kind to the next poor relation who came under his roof in a way he had never been to the first, which was perhaps the only good thing Lucien Ferrers ever caused in the world, and caused it entirely by accident. As for Ferrers himself, the county saw little more of him. His creditors took what there was to take, which was less than they were owed. His name became a thing said with a curl of the lip. The fashionable doors that opened to his charm closed one by one, quietly, in the way such doors close, without a scene, simply by never opening again. He went to town, and then, when town grew too warm, further, and the last that was ever certainly known of him was that he had gone abroad in the company of Mrs. Sabine Farley, the two fugitives bound together at the end by the one thing that had ever truly united them, which was that no one else would have either of them. It was not a cruel end, as ends go. It was only the exact size of men and women who had made it. They had wagered on a woman's smallness and lost to her largeness, and they spent the rest of their lives, one must suppose, telling each other it had been bad luck, which is the story that all such people tell, and the reason they never learn. They were married 3 weeks later, in the small stone chapel at Rendon, with no county to watch them, and no one present who had not earned the right to be there. Lady Merian stood up with her brother and wept, which she had sworn she would not do, and did anyway, and never afterward admitted. Sir Osric gave his niece away, humbled and quiet, and a good deal kinder to her in those 3 weeks than he had been in the whole 20 years before, for a man who has come within a sentence of doing a great wrong sometimes spends the rest of his life a better man for the fright of it. And Sir Osric, to his credit, was one of them. The groom who had ridden the unsaddled hunter 11 miles across the flooded fields stood at the back of the chapel in a newt the Duke had given him, and was, that day and every day after, the most valued man in the Rendon stables, and knew why, and never spoke of it, which was why. And Iantha Wenlock walked up the short aisle to the man waiting for her at the altar in no borrowed finery and no hateful white, but in a gown of soft dove grey she had chosen herself, the colour of weather coming in off the sea. and gave him her hand of her own free will for the second time and the last, and this time there was no one in the world with any power to take it back. The Duke of Renden, who had been cold for 20 years, thawed slowly, the way iron thaws, from the inside and without any fuss. And the county that had feared him watched it happen over the following years with the particular astonishment of people who find they have been wrong about a man his whole life. It was the wife, they said. It was the little Wenlock girl, the one Ferrers jilted, the one the Duke married out of the very church. And they were right, though they never guessed the half of how right they were, for it was not that she softened him exactly, but that she was the one person on the earth he had never stood still in front of, and a man who need never hold still learns, in time, to move again. She grew, in the light of Renden, into everything the darkness of Harcombe had never let her be. She had been raised to be grateful, to be small, to be unregarded in the corner of every room, and she found at Renden that she was regarded, that her opinion was asked and weighed, that her steadiness was leaned upon, that the tenants and the servants and by slow degrees the whole neighbourhood came to bring their troubles to the Duchess of Renden, because she had the rare gift, learned in a hard school, of looking at a person exactly as long as it took to truly see them. The girl no one had troubled to look at became the woman everyone came to be seen by. She never forgot how that felt from either side. It made her the best thing that had ever happened to that corner of the country, and the Duke, watching her do it, thought sometimes that saving her had been the least of what he had done, that the greater thing, by far, had been to stand out of her way and let the county at last discover what he had seen in a dark orangery in the space of a dozen heartbeats. In the first winter of their marriage there came an evening that Ianthe would hold to her whole life. A great dinner was given at Renden, the first the Duke had hosted in a decade, and the county came, the same county that had once looked through her at Harcombe, the same matrons who had never troubled to learn her name. And she stood at the head of her husband's table in a gown the colour of deep claret, the Duchess of Renden, and she watched them arrive and bow and remember, all at once and to their evident discomfort, that this composed and gracious woman was the poor Wenlock niece they had never thought worth a second glance. She was courtesy itself to every one of them. She did not gloat. She had no need of it. The room did her gloating for her, in the anxious smiles of people who had learned too late that they had misjudged someone, and could not now unmisjudge them, and must live with it. And late in the evening the Duke came and stood beside her at the window while the company murmured behind them, and he did not say anything, but he took her hand and turned it over and held it, palm to palm, and she understood that he had seen the whole of it too, and that this exact reversal, this quiet vindication without a single cruel word spoken, was a thing he had given her as deliberately as he had given her his name, and she loved him for it past all speaking. "You planned this," she murmured, not quite a question. "I planned a dinner," said the Duke gravely. "The rest of it planned itself. I only thought it was time the county was made to look at my wife. It has been avoiding the exercise for 20 years, and I found I could not forgive it that any longer." And she laughed low, the first fully unguarded laugh he had ever drawn from her. And several people turned at the sound, for no one at Renden had heard the Duke's Duchess laugh like that before, and it was, they all agreed afterward, quite transforming. They were happy. It is a plain word, and they were plainly it. Not in the manner of the ballads, all sighs and swooning, for neither of them was made that way, but in the deeper manner of two people who had each been sold once and had each refused, and who therefore never for one day took for granted the strange grace of a life freely chosen. He was not a demonstrative man, but he had a way of an evening of taking her hand where it rested and turning it over and holding it, palm to palm, hard the way he had held it first in a carriage in the rain, the way a person holds the one thing in the world that floats, and she never once, in all the long good years of it, had to wonder what it meant. Sometimes, when the fire was low and the house was quiet, she would ask him, half-teasing, wholly loving, whether he had known, that first night in the orangery, watching a stranger's marriage die in her face, that it would come to this. And the Duke of Renden, who did not lie to her, would consider the question with the same grave honesty he brought to everything, and would say, "No, I knew only that I could not stand by. Everything else you did. You bowed to me in the dark when you had every reason to weep. You held to Thursday when Thursday would not hold. You took the veil out of your own hair and stepped over it and chose me before 200 people who had never chosen you for anything. I did not make your fate, Iantha. I only opened the door. You are the one who walked through it on your own feet with your head level, and you have been walking through it ever since, and I have had the great good fortune to walk beside you, and that is the whole of the story, and I would not change 1 hour of it, not even the worst. And she would lean her head against his shoulder in the firelight, the once portionless girl who had been called a face maid for a governess by a man the world had long forgotten, and who was now beloved past the telling of it by the one man the world had said could not love at all. And outside the tall windows the dark park of Renden would lie quiet under the stars, and neither of them, having each been carried once toward a life they did not choose, would ever again be carried anywhere by anyone, for they had chosen freely and forever. And there is no fate on this earth stronger than that.